MS Plus acknowledges the traditional owners of the land this podcast has been recorded on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Hi, my name's Jodie Hartson. I'm Executive Manager of Client Engagement and Wellbeing at MS Plus. I'd like to introduce Simon Webster, who I'm chatting with today about accessing the right information. Information is chaos many of the times, and it's really difficult to navigate which is good information and which isn't good information. Fortunately, Simon's going to help guide us through that chaos and give us some tips on how to navigate information. Simon is part of the team that develops content for the website for MS Trust in the UK, which supports people living with MS in the UK. So welcome, Simon.
So let's talk about the best with MS. One thing that I learned pretty quickly as time went on in my 20-year career was that often, initially in the early days, I was the one delivering the message about what MS is going to mean for you. Then over time, it really quickly changed. Before I'd even got a chance to see people, they'd already had a bit of a base information that was guiding them. So how do you feel that early information impacts people? And how would be your top tips, I guess, or your guidance for people to say where to look and how to do that in the early days?
I'd sort of very much recognise what you're saying there as well. When the basic level of question that we get now is several steps up from the basic level of question we were getting 20 years. It's the natural inclination, isn't it? You go online and you type in and you see what comes out. And if you're lucky, it's something helpful. If you're unlucky, it gives you a tail to chase around. And some of the conversations are dealing with misconceptions that people have started with, perhaps, as well. No, there was always the thing, sort of, don't use Dr. Google, but, people do. And you can't blame anybody for doing that. But I think I would advise somebody who's thinking of doing that to pick and choose where they take the information from. And I think at newly diagnosed level, I would encourage people to look at sort of the MS charities, MS Trust, MS Society over here, MS Australia, and then the equivalent of whatever over in Australia, and go to organisations that will have filtered the information and collated the information and thought about how to present it in a way that is accessible and not overwhelming and not frightening for people at that point. It may well be frightening because of the nature of the diagnosis. They will have picked out the information that is relevant for that point in time. So people won't be presented with all the potential sort of dark corners and worst case scenarios that will naturally be going through their heads as well, but will be given a good sort of solid grounding in what is MS and what does it mean for me at the moment. Then use that as the basis to talk about that information with their MS nurse, with their neurologist, with their MS team, and use it as a building block, as a way to have informed conversations.
Yeah, I agree that the messaging about not using Dr. Google, the majority of people I found in my experience were pretty good at filtering and pretty good at looking at it and saying, well, this information's got some problems with it. We're so used to all that information now and filtering it for ourselves. One thing I found quite interesting as well was that people with an early diagnosis, you talked about the information being fright, and that was certainly really my experience. A lot of people would have a quick look and then think, that's all I can take on.
Yeah.
And I said, that's okay. You're not the one who has to get all the information. It's there for you when you want it, when you need it. But you don't have to get all the information at once. So do you find that when you look at who's accessing your information about newly diagnosed and when you get feedback on that, how do you deliver your information so that it's not overwhelming?
Yeah, there are different styles in information gathering, from people who want everything on day one to the people who are almost in denial, but will sort of peek from behind the sofa every now and again, just and pick information up like that. And often we found in partnerships or whatever, the one partner will be behind the sofa, the other one will be the information gatherer. The more abstract question, somebody might be happy in gathering information, then something specifically happens like a relapse or something, a particular crisis, and then they might want to shy away from the information. I was talking to a nurse recently broadly on this topic, and she was saying that she's naturally an information gatherer, but when a family member was diagnosed with something, not with MS, but was diagnosed with something, suddenly she couldn't look at the information because it was too raw and too close. And all of that's fine. I mean, people are going to sort of change in their information needs from moment to moment, and it'll probably be a surprise to the individual that how they respond to the information. So be aware of that when trying to present the information as well, particularly through the helpline, to match the information to that person's information needs and also that person's ability to deal with the information at that time as well. When it comes to presenting our newly diagnosed information, we worked very closely with people with MS on their information needs around diagnosis. And instead of sort of presenting a slab of information about MS, we did work hard to sort of chunk it up into bite-sized pieces that people could pick and choose from. So a much more sort of modular approach, if you like, so that people could find their way through the information at their own speed.
From your perspective, has it changed a lot over the last 10, 15 years in the information needs and information delivery?
The growth in use of the internet has sort of brought people who are sort of wanting more immediate answers to issues. And I think social media has sped that up again even more so. The information gatherers wanting the information almost at their fingertips immediately. And social media, again, has also sort of opened up misinformation in the now that there's much more, it's sort of kind of peer-led what topics are talked about when you're talking on social media. And of course, people with MS are not purely a medical case. They are people with lives, work, benefits, families, all of these things, as well as medical issues. And all of those get pulled into the equation and make the topics more multifaceted, perhaps, than they were in the past when there wasn't that level of interaction that we have with social media now.
I guess that's a bit about how storytelling's become so important. Storytelling's become the way of people giving information and receiving information that wasn't available or wasn't really as much as a resource before social media became a big thing. Or have you seen any impact of misinformation, I guess, in terms of people not getting right information? Do you think there's more need to correct myths and do myth busting now than there ever has been?
I think it's made it more prominent. In some cases, misinformation, and that's certainly true, of misunderstandings and kind of personal hobby horses, if you like, sort of evangelists for particular churches or particular ideas, have a platform on social media which can be very persuasive. I think everyone needs to be sort of very careful about the conversations that they're having with people, to not saying that they're necessarily wrong, but to sort of consider carefully why the conversation is going this way and whether there are other options, and to be much more critical in their thinking about the information that they're dealing with. I mean, in the past, it was tended to be sort of, this is a fact, here is some information here. You had to sort of judge whether the person telling you the facts was reliable or not. But now on a personal level, you're also getting people saying this is a fact and this is my opinion, and you're getting a whole load of emotion-based information almost, really, that's coming through. And I think that requires a different set of skills to assess and sift through and pick out what is useful and how you respond to what's being presented. Particularly if you're part of a conversation where you're a dissenting voice amongst a lot of people who support a particular idea. It can sometimes be difficult to think, actually, I'm not sure I believe in this, or I don't believe in this to the extent that these people believe in it, and I'm not fully going to engage with this if a group is there advocating a particular approach or not.
What would you say to someone if they sort of said, what skills do you think I need when I approach, I've got MS, Simon, tell me about how I'm going to approach the information. What skills should I be looking for? What mindset should I get myself into?
I think with information of any sort, but particularly I think online, is thinking, who is telling me this and why? And they qualified to give me this information. That doesn't need to be sort of formal qualifications, doesn't need to be the Professor XYZ of so-and-so university. But if somebody's telling me about their experiences, can I validate their reason for telling me this information? But also why they're telling me this? What do they want me to do based on this information? Are they just giving me this information in its purest sense? Are they wanting me to start thinking in a particular way? Are they wanting me to buy something? Are they wanting me to avoid something? And not taking everything at face value, sort of being sort of skeptical, making every piece of information justify itself, kind of running everything through a filter, saying, do I believe this? Why do I believe this? Why do I think this about this piece of information?
Yeah, I think that's really important when you're listening to someone's stories. I would often encourage people to say, why do I need this information? What's going wrong, or where am I at that I need this piece of information? Is it just because I have a doubt, I have a fear? And often that asking why I need the information, who's delivering it for me, you really need to get in the headspace before you read medical information, because it's so easy to be subjective to it. I sort of would often also suggest that people don't do it in the middle of the night, because your filters aren't on and you're not sitting there saying, okay, I need to get my filters on when I'm looking at information that potentially can be alarming, overwhelming, frightening, inaccurate, all the things that we know information can be. One of the things I think that people really struggled with is understanding research. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how you've gone about doing that and how you would encourage people to search and know what is a peer review.
Yeah, there is an awful lot out there. And of course, the challenge of science is that it never stops. And there aren't absolutes. And over time, opinions may change and different studies may come to contradictory answers or answers that seem to undermine what's come before. I know that people sometimes find that frustrating, a couple of years ago you said X was good and now you're saying it's not so good. But it's important to recognize that science is always probing itself and asking itself questions and trying to build on itself and move forward. Ideally, it's going back to the source, really, to the basic information where it started from. But as with other things, it's sort of thinking, who is telling me this and why? Is this written by people who have expertise in the area? What is their expertise? It is appearing in a peer-reviewed journal. So it's gone through a panel of independent experts who kind of tested the information before it's got to publication. So the information is as robust as possible by the time it's published.
So how would people know that? A lot of articles that are published under the guise of research. It seems anyone can do research, really. I had a little cue that I would say to people, if you're looking at it on Google Scholar, look how many people have referenced it. Because if a lot of people have referenced it, it usually means that it's got credibility. There's lots of ways of determining credibility. If 2,000 people have referenced this article and it's cited, which just means referenced, it's got a bit of credibility.
Yes, I would also keep an eye on how many people are involved. A study of 5 people can give the information, but it's hard to extrapolate for wider numbers. If you're dealing with hundreds of people, it gives more confidence in the findings when it's done over a large population. But equally, though, bearing in mind that the result of a medical trial is the average across that number of people. It doesn't mean that whatever the outcome will be the case for an individual. It just means across a large average of people, that was the sort of level it came to. And some people will do better and some people will do worse. So not seeing a medical trial as meaning this will happen to me.
Well, you talked earlier about skills that people need. And I guess in terms of, that practical, how do I look at information? One of the things that people talk about is confirmation bias. And so can you explain that to us and how that impacts when you're looking for information and how you use information?
Yeah, confirmation bias is the phenomenon. We tend to look at information or look for information that agrees with a pre-existing point of view. We will be drawn towards things that agree with what we believe in or which fit with what we were hoping to find. And we all have sort of prejudices and opinions and points of view. So it's very difficult to approach information in a sort of completely pure Zen-like state without any of these things. But it's also important to be aware of them and sort of examine yourself when you're sort of looking at information and think, perhaps I chose this one over that one. Is there any reason why the one I didn't choose wasn't good, or is it just because it's not saying the sort of things I wanted to say? So it's a case of maybe sort of challenging yourself to read things that maybe contradict your biases. And I don't think you could sort of entirely get rid of confirmation bias in one's approach to information, but sort of being aware that such a thing exists. And social media does that harder in that they will tend to present you with information that's similar to the information that you looked at previously. So I'll sort of push that towards the top of the list or present that thread for you. So there is a risk that you end up in a little bubble of opinions that you already believe in, and it's harder to get to the information that presents the other point of view.
Yes, it's certainly not made any easier. I think that's really important. And do you think there's any particular areas where that's a real hotspot, I suppose, in the management of MS that can really be, I guess, really challenging for people? Is there any areas that you would say that you even notice in your trust information delivery that there are certain areas that's particularly challenging for people with MS?
I think it could be an issue when you're dealing with things that are considered a little bit sort of left field. So, for instance, in stem cells, HSCT recently, people sort of travelling overseas for treatment, which I think has been the case in the UK, and I believe also in the case in Australia as well. And you're constantly fed sort of information about people who've done that and had successful treatment overseas and so on. You're not necessarily going to be presented with the people who's had a different experience with it, and you might start to see a biased view of the topic based on what you've already searched for. And there'll be other instances of, not that HSTT is necessarily a left field treatment, but it sort of started as something experimental that has been talked up by people who are very keen on it as an idea. But I mean, there are other approaches that people might have tried. So CCSVI, I think, which was a thing a few years.
That was a huge one in terms of where it really showed how information was, CCSVI was an example where information can really take people on a journey. Most experts don't come eagerly to presenting their point of view because often the news, the media, they're much more the story appeals rather than the fact. And often the neurologists in particular were misinterpreted. So often they were reluctant to speak about it at all. And people would say, well, if you think that way, why aren't you talking on the TV? It was because their messages were so often misinterpreted. I remember in CCSVI that the neurologists in Canada were starting to get threats and had to close some services because the social media became really so big on that.
It seems to be less so. It seemed to have its moment and it has gone. But it was, a reasonable theoretical idea that then sort of got rather blown up on the social media side of it and aspect of it, which did sort of alter how an aspect of MS and MS research for a number of years, and turned out to be a bit of a side road, unfortunately. But I suppose it shows the power of social media to do that, but also the risk of social media as well, in that a lot of people demanding something doesn't necessarily mean that they are right, or what they are hoping will be investigated will turn out to be right.
I guess a lot of likes doesn't make it a truth.
Yes.
And a lot of likes is a good story, and it certainly, I think, reflects that what we were talking about earlier on why you want the information, who's delivering the information. Those are such importance to ask yourself before you read any information in terms of saying, why do I want something better? Or who don't I trust here to say I'm not on the best treatment for me, or this is not the best pathway for me? I think they're really good to ask yourself when you go about seeking information. Most countries have an organisation that do sometimes slowly and sometimes a lot less glamorously present information about where you can cross-check. Say, okay, let's cross-check what they're saying about it. And yes, it's likely to be more conservative. That's the truth. But nonetheless, be that, I guess, that not confirmation bias, that person who sort of presents the facts and presents the information by and large to the very best of their ability to be completely unbiased.
Yes, it's sort of trying to take the steam out of the conversation sometimes, I think, is important. There are strong opinions and people who advocate particular approaches, which is, you need people like that to drive change sometimes, but they are not necessarily the best people to give you an objective overview of the topic and to allow you to make your own judgment about what the situation is. So we have had several situations where we've gone into a topic and tried to present it in as dispassionate ways to balance some of the information that's also available out there.
Yes, it can make us all seem quite boring.
Yes,
but certainly not in certainly not in MS Trust. So wrapping up a little bit, what would you suggest for people in terms of information seeking? And my other question is there any red flags that you would say to someone, hey, check yourself and know yourself? This is a red flag.
I think it's going back to sort of all sources and knowing, as we said at the beginning, who is telling you the information and what angle coming from. It doesn't mean that talking to people on social media is bad and you should only talk to an MS organisation or read medical journals, but sort of being aware of how the information is being presented and the sort of information that you're getting from the different sources and judging it. The manufacturer will want to present their product in the best polite and maybe sort of play down the less useful aspects, but so long as you're aware of that, then there's useful information there. There's medical research or the MS charities might give you sort of an objective point of view. Some people might consider that sort of the establishment view and maybe sort of have issues there, but that's what they're going to present. What you get from people on social media will be a personal opinion, which you have to take into account where they're coming from, but equally it'll give you an idea of how that topic feels to an individual who's gone through it as well, and give you a personal aspect. And I think gathering information is a patchwork of all of those sort of different things and seeing how they fit in together to give you the wider picture. If you talk to a doctor, they will give you a medical opinion about something, but you might want a social opinion as well from other angles, and picking and choosing the information, but being aware of where you're picking and choosing from and and how you're putting together that patchwork of information, I think, is helpful. Red flags, if something feels too good to be true, chances are it might be. And at the very least, rate it somewhere else and try and find other sources that tell you the same information and see if they present it in the same sort of way. But yes, particularly bearing in mind if you're getting the information from people who are trying to sell you something, because even indirectly, because of course they're trying to sell you something, and you don't advertise by being self-deprecating, you advertise by being bold. If in doubt, double check the information and triangulate things, and also being very aware of oneself, I think is important. If you're sort of faced with information, people's experiences of various things, they will be coming from a different place from where you're starting. So just because something has been wonderful for one person, it's important to think, am I in a similar situation? If that happened to me, would that actually be what I wanted to happen? And how would I use that information? Something that we suggest sometimes, particularly in areas where there isn't a lot of definitive information, some of the lifestyle issues and diet and so on, is check that what's suggested is safe. You're not going to poison yourself by taking supplement X on. Is it affordable? And then keep a symptom diary for a test period and just sort of measure it, how it affects you. If the internet is full of people saying this is the best thing ever, give it a trial for a month or two. Keep a note of your symptoms day to day and any changes in activity, medication, other issues as well. And at the end of the trial period, look back and think, well, what did it do for me? And if it did make changes, keep on doing it. If it didn't, well, you know that it didn't work for you regardless of what anybody else says, and move on and try the next thing. So I think keeping one sense of oneself in the middle of all of this, because sometimes that can get swept away with strong opinions, is an important thing as well.
I think that knowing yourself is really important, because even knowing how you're going to receive information in a certain way can be a really important one as well too. Like in terms of, I know that when I read information, it'll often take me a bit to process, or I'll need to concentrate on processing that story is not necessarily what's going to happen to me. And that was another thing which I found, just because that person didn't go well there, or that person went really well there, doesn't mean that's going to be my story. And if you're a person who takes it on a lot, and go, I might read something and get very excited about it and think, hang on, I need to have that person who can self-check, or who can check for me. If I can't self-check, have someone who can check for me. When I normally read social media posts, I normally am that person who all of a sudden feels really down because everyone seems so happy. That's one type of person. And the other person is the type of person who says, oh, well, that's them, that's not me, and I'm good with that. And I think that really, if you can see how you normally engage with information, all of those things will be transferred into how you engage with information about your medical condition as well too. Yeah. And that sort of understanding will give you a really good platform to say, this is what I need. Well, I think it's so important in terms of how you're going to live with MS. And especially nowadays, there's so much available and it's so big. So how you're going to live with MS, how to get and use information is just, and how it's going to work for you and your family and those around you is just it's such an important part of the way that we manage the disease. I think underestimated as a nurse, red flags were really when I thought, hey, I think you're getting too much. There's a lot of information that you're taking on, and I can see it all around you. You're trying to kind of, it's just so big and so much information, and it's almost the skills that you need to do, and having your own thing, having your own rules to self, if you like, the things that we've talked about. Have your right headspace. Ask yourself those questions. Have them written down before you seek information. Say, where is this coming from? Who is the source? What is this information telling me? And is it confirmation bias or is it not confirmation bias? And how can I check back? It'll give you that balance. It's not as deeply, richly informed by lived experience. Storytelling is so powerful and so inspiring, and a really important part of self-efficacy, like in terms of saying, if Simon can do it, so can I. And that's one way of doing it.
It's probably worth remembering also that people tend to tell stories because things have gone well, or equally because they've gone badly. People don't tend to tell stories of things going, okay. So you will tend to get to the extremes of experience, which is great. It can be inspiring, or it can be a warning about things that can go wrong, but not necessarily typical. And as you say, it's not necessarily going to have to be your experience, but it can still be inspiring or helpful from somebody else's experience. But you don't know how many people are in the, it went okay, but it's nothing spectacular bit in the middle.
Simon, it's been amazing. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your dedication to giving people information with MS. It's a vital part of living well with MS.
For more information on anything that we have covered today, please get in touch with MS Plus Connect on free call 1800 042 138 or email connect@msplus.org.au. And don't forget to find the MS Podcast on your favourite podcast player, such as Apple, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, or you can just access the podcast directly on the website, www.msplus.org.au. If you liked the podcast, please leave us a review.